Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. So sorry for the technical difficulties. We are going to try to get this through this as quickly as possible, but not spending any time wasting. So we're going to get started now. So on behalf of the Department of Education and Health and Human Services, it's our pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, which is the fourth in a 5-part series that addresses the foster care provisions of the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. Today's webinar focuses specifically on the need for education and child welfare agencies to work together to develop procedures for transporting children in foster care to their schools of origin. My name is Stevie Steinis, and I serve as a Chief Deputy in the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families within the U.S. Departments of Health and Human Services. I am joined by Mary Mislevich, a Casey Fellow in the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Innovation and Improvement. We will also be hearing from our colleagues in Washington, D.C. and San Diego, who have helped develop and implement transportation policies in their respective states. We are delighted to be joined by Dr. Michelle Lustig, who is the manager of the Foster Youth and Homeless Education Services Unit at the San Diego County Office of Education, and Tracy Talbert, who is a special support and contract liaison with D.C.'s Child and Family Services Agency. As we did with previous webinars in this series, we'll begin today's presentation by providing a high-level overview of the federal framework for ensuring the educational stability for children in foster care. We'll then do a deeper dive into the provisions in ESSA and the joint guidance that address transportation. Next, we'll hear from our partners in Washington, D.C. and San Diego, who will share with us some promising practices in their respective jurisdictions related to transporting children to their schools of origin. Finally, and if we have time remaining, we'll conclude by engaging in Q&A with our panelists. This next slide provides a timeline of the evolution of the Educational Stability Framework for Children in Foster Care. On the left is a reference to the Fostering Connections Act of 2008, which was the first federal step towards supporting school stability for children in foster care. For the purposes of this webinar series, Fostering Connections is notable in that it requires child welfare agencies to collaborate with educational agencies to ensure the educational stability of children in foster care. The next point on the timeline references the December 2015 enactment of the Every Student Succeeds Act. ESSA builds on Fostering Connections and institutes complementary collaboration requirements for educational agencies. Considered together, these two laws make clear that the educational stability of children in foster care is a joint responsibility of both agencies. The final 3 points on this timeline highlight our current efforts to assist education and child welfare agencies in implementing the educational stability provisions of ESSA by December of this year. Turning now to some key ESSA provisions that will be instrumental in improving the educational outcomes for youth in care. ESSA requires SEAs to provide assurances that children in foster care remain in their school of origin unless it is determined that it is not in his or her best interest to do so. If it is determined that a child should not remain in his or her school of origin, a child should be immediately enrolled in their new school, even if he or she does not have the required documents for enrollment. ESSA requires each state agency, or SEA, to designate a point of contact for child welfare agencies. The SEA point of contact is responsible for overseeing the implementation of the educational stability provisions of ESSA. ESSA also requires local education agencies, or LEAs, to establish POCs for local child welfare agencies if the corresponding child welfare agency notifies the LEA in writing that it has designated a point of contact. To that end, we have included a template letter in the joint guidance that child welfare agencies may use to provide sufficient written notice to LEAs of point of contact designation. Over the course of this webinar series, we have been repeatedly asked whether child welfare agencies may notify LEAs of their designated POC via email. The answer to that question is yes. Email notification from a child welfare agency will trigger the requirement in ESSA for LEAs to establish a POC of their own. Finally, and as Mary will soon address in more detail, ESSA requires LEAs to provide assurances that they will collaborate with state or local child welfare agencies to develop and implement written procedures that outline how transportation to school will be provided, arranged, and funded for the duration of a child's time in foster care. If you'd like to learn more about ESSA's best interest, immediate enrollment, and/or POC provisions, links to previous webinars on these topics are provided in a slide in today's presentation. It's also important to note that ESSA amends the McKinney-Vento Act. It removes from the definition of homeless children and youth those children who are awaiting foster care placement. For all non-covered states, this change is effective December 10, 2016. For covered states, this change is effective December 10, 2017. After the effective date, children who previously met the definition of homeless based solely on their status as awaiting foster care placement will no longer be eligible for McKinney-Vento services. These children will, however, be covered by ESSA, as SEAs and LEAs must meet the ESSA educational stability requirements for all children in foster care, including those awaiting foster care placement, by December 10, 2016. Of note, children who continue to meet the revised definition of homeless, for example, youth who are living in transitional shelters, motels, or are doubled up, will remain eligible for McKinney-Vento services regardless of their foster care status. We recognize that the changes to McKinney-Vento are both significant and nuanced. If you have specific questions about these changes, we encourage you to review the guidance that ED released last month on the Education for Homeless Children and Youth program, a link for which is on this slide, and/or to reach out directly to the Department of Education using the contact information that we share at the end of this webinar. On June 23rd, HHS and ED released joint guidance on educational stability that builds upon and adds clarity to the statutory framework set forth in ESSA. The guidance addresses in detail all of the topics listed on this slide and also provides examples of promising practices that states and districts have implemented following the passage of Fostering Connections in 2008. As I mentioned earlier, today's webinar is the fourth in a five-part series aimed at helping the field implement the educational stability provisions of ESSA. Our first webinar provided an overview of the entirety of the joint guidance. The second webinar addressed points of contact, and last week's webinar focused on best interest determinations and immediate enrollment. This slide includes links to the webinar recordings and slide decks for each of these presentations. Next week's webinar will address effective collaboration between educational and child welfare agencies. We will be sending out an invitation for next week's webinar soon, so please check your email for the registration information. I'm now going to pass it over to my colleague from the Department of Education, Kelly Mislevich, who will address the topic of today's webinar, transportation.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mary Mislevich. Thank you so much for joining us. So I'm going to begin with a review of the ESSA transportation provisions. Under ESSA, LEAs must provide assurances that they will collaborate with state or local child welfare agencies to develop and implement clear and written procedures for how transportation will be provided, arranged, and funded for the duration of their time in foster care. These procedures must ensure that children will promptly receive transportation in a cost-effective manner and in accordance with the Fostering Connections Act. LEAs must also provide assurances that they will collaborate with their state or local child welfare agencies to ensure that if there are additional costs incurred in providing transportation to the school of origin, LEAs will provide transportation to the school of origin if the local child welfare agency agrees to reimburse the LEA agrees to pay the cost, or the LEA and local child welfare agency agree to share the cost. So moving on to the guidance, as Phoebe mentioned, the guidance breaks down the provisions and provides more clarity and recommendations for effective implementation. So firstly, the guidance states that all LEAs are required to meet the transportation requirements of ESSA, regardless of whether or not they currently provide transportation to other children in the LEA who are not in foster care. Next, ESSA requires that the transportation procedures shall ensure that children in foster care will promptly receive transportation in a cost-effective manner. And the guidance gives several examples of what would constitute a cost-effective approach to avoid any additional costs. So some low-cost or no-cost options in the guidance include utilizing public transportation, using pre-existing bus stops that provide transportation to students for other programs such as magnet schools or MCKINNEY-VENTO. LEAs and child welfare agencies can also work with foster parents and caregivers to see if they are able to provide transportation. In addition, LEAs can look to see if the child is eligible for transportation by other programs such as IDEA. And we're going to be hearing about how some jurisdictions use these alternative options later in the webinar. ESSA does not define promptly, but the guidance recommends that the transportation plan should be set up as soon as possible to avoid any disruptions or delays. Finally, LEAs should continue to pay for the regular costs to transport a child to the school of origin. Only the additional costs, or the difference between what an LEA would spend to transport a child in foster care to their assigned school and the cost of transporting a child in foster care to their school of origin, are to be addressed in the transportation procedures. So for example, if there's already an established bus route that the LEA can use to transport the child to their school of origin, then that would not constitute any additional cost. Moving on, the guidance also describes which federal funding sources may be used to pay for the additional transportation costs. Title IV-E federal funds are available for those children in foster care who meet the income eligibility and other requirements. At this time, less than 50% of children in foster care are eligible for Title IV-E. Tribal children in foster care may also be eligible for Title IV-E if they meet the eligibility requirements and are in the placement and care of a state, one of several tribes operating a direct Title IV-E program, or one of the many tribes that have a Title IV-E agreement with the state. Child welfare agencies may decide whether to include these costs in a child's IV-E foster care payment, and they have the discretion in determining what is considered reasonable travel, and they may take into account factors such as cost, distance, and duration of travel. While Title IV-E is available for the federal portion of the transportation, the state child welfare agency is responsible for the state match, which varies by state but averages between 25 to 50% for the foster care maintenance payments and is always 50% for the administrative costs. On the education side, LEAs may use Title I funds for transportation. Although the funds that are reserved for comparable services for homeless children and youth may not be used for transportation. The guidance urges LEAs and child welfare agencies to work together to maximize all available funding sources, including federal funds, to pay for the additional transportation costs and ensure that these costs do not unduly burden one agency. At the state level, the guidance recommends that the SEA work collaboratively with the state child welfare agencies to provide uniform state guidelines for how the transportation procedures should be implemented across the state. And this will ensure consistency and avoid any confusion when setting up transportation across jurisdictional lines. At the local level, the LEA and child welfare agency should work together to develop and implement the transportation procedures and should make every effort possible to reach agreement on how the transportation costs will be covered. Transportation is a central component of school stability and may be needed to meet the requirements of both ESSA and fostering connections to keep the child in their school of origin if it is considered to be in their best interest. So child welfare and education agencies will need to coordinate in order to both meet their joint obligations. Finally, the guidance recognizes that there may be times when the LEA and child welfare agency have difficulty coming to an agreement about transportation costs. However, these transportation procedures must be developed and implemented by December 10th, 2016, so that the child can promptly receive transportation to their school of origin. The transportation procedures should address how the requirement will be met if the parties cannot come to agreement. So for example, the guidance suggests that the procedures could include a local dispute resolution process the agencies would follow in the event of such a disagreement, and that the SEAs would develop that in collaboration with the state child welfare agency. The LEA must provide or arrange for adequate and appropriate transportation to and from the school of origin while any disputes are being resolved. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Stevie. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. We will now turn the webinar over to our colleagues from San Diego and Washington, D.C., who will share with us their agencies' respective experiences implementing transportation policies. At the conclusion of their presentations, we hope we'll have time for questions with the panelists. So please submit any questions you have as they arrive via the Q&A box. We will first hear from Dr. Michelle Lustig from the San Diego County Office of Education. In addition to her role as the manager of Foster Youth Services Coordinating Program and Homeless Education, Dr. Lustig is the president and CEO of Foster Horizons, a consulting firm focused on improving the educational outcomes of students in foster care through cross-system collaboration and trauma-informed practices. Dr. Lustig has created several nationally recognized programs that support and increase school stability and academic outcomes for students in foster care, and she has over 30 years of experience in public and private child welfare, research, and education. We're so glad to have you with us here today. Dr. Lustig, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So we have, as some of you may know, in California, been working around many of the provisions in ESSA for a number of years when AB 490 was passed way back in 2004. So our issues and our way of managing the necessity to keep kids in their school of origin has had, we've been doing that work for some time now. We always start, as has already been mentioned, with best interest considerations, and a form that we use locally was shared with you with your presentation materials earlier this morning, and I'm going to refer to that now. The form is called the Best Interest Determination Form, and there are a variety of considerations, especially when you start thinking about the age of the child and the commute time, that we always want to make sure is on the forefront of the decision-making process around children remaining in their school of origin. And some of those considerations include just how long that commute is going to take, and the current traffic patterns, if they're going with or against traffic, the time, really literally time in the school year of the placement change, how long they might be having to do that long commute, and all the different types of things that would come into play in the child's day. If their school schedule could be adjusted for a later start time, what the impact on their extracurriculars, et cetera, might be, and really just what the capacity of the child is. Sometimes those commutes can really be burdensome on the child, and they really will not be able to endure it and then still focus in school when they get there. So we just always start with that consideration. Obviously, there is no way for any one entity to do this type of transportation alone. It requires a lot of people working together, and oftentimes we find that people think it's just a matter of setting up a transport, and it's actually much more than that. There are different pieces of information that different entities and stakeholders have regarding a child's schedule, day, school, disruptions to their day, and if everyone isn't working together and sharing that information, it's going to become very problematic very, very fast, and also not be cost-effective and potentially waste a lot of funds. So we really need to encourage people to work across systems and across agencies to think deeply and in an ongoing manner about what those different considerations are and what those changes may look like. And we need to really remain flexible and open so that we can respond to those changes and not get bogged down by them. Here we talk a lot about minimum days and testing days and those types of things that change a child's school schedule, court dates, doctor's appointments, sibling visits, therapy, all of those types of things that really can affect pickups and drop-offs. Cost effectiveness is, those considerations become much more difficult depending on the age of the child, depending on the distance of the commute. We do some transports here that I'll talk about that are actually quite costly, and I just encourage people to consider not just cost in dollars, but cost in the child's life. So if you have a child that is making 3 or 4 placement moves in a school year, and the one thing that is stable in their life is their school, is the cost we really want to be looking at the financial cost, or do we really want to be looking at the cost to the child and their academic and social and emotional development? We'll talk a little bit about some creative solutions. We've had many over the years that we have seen happen, some with us and some outside of us. And again, to the point of really needing to have point people, dedicated people, people whose job it is to be a part of these transportation arrangements and the actual provision of transportation services, particularly when different entities and agencies are doing that together. So our local efforts here in San Diego started several years back when we applied for and were successful in receiving a collaborative grant through ACF, which was the Child Welfare Education and the Courts Grant. That grant was really focused on school stability, and one of the things that we used those funds for and helped to develop through that grant process was a transportation support program, primarily because what we had heard for years and years here locally was school stability is great, school of origin matters, how are we going to get that child there? And in our research of how to do that here in San Diego, we found that the best way for us to do that was to contract with local transportation companies. Those are literally cab and taxi companies that we contract with using a variety of funding sources over the years to be able to get kids to school of origin. And we have our partner Child Welfare Agency background check those drivers so that they are all cleared as county volunteers. And then our staff here and our manager who oversees transportation here in our office at the County Office of Ed does some training and orientation with those drivers to understand the unique sort of situations that children in foster care are. Some of those transportation companies have done school transports before and some of them haven't. I wanted to just mention Butte County, which is a small rural county in California. Many years ago, they began pooling money in that region of the state from multiple agencies across systems to be able to transport kids to school of origin, with their County Office of Education and Megan Malloy being in charge of administrating that transportation. We have in California, for our special education students, local special education local plan areas, or SELPAs, and those agreements are often utilized around how different school districts in different regions of the county will share services, including transportation services. So we do recommend that folks look to their special ed colleagues within school districts, because often some school districts only have transportation for their special ed students. During the recession, many of our school districts retired buses and laid off bus drivers, and they've never hired back or repurchased those buses. And so their only transportation is special education transportation, at least currently. And last, we have had in California, going into our third year, of a new funding formula for education called the Local Control Funding Formula that included local control accountability plans that each district has to complete each year. And students in foster care were identified as a subgroup prior to ESSA identifying them as a subgroup, where special considerations needed to be given and specific services and supports needed to be provided. In some instances, school districts have included transportation to school of origin and school stability as their goal for their students in foster care, and that will be another way that I believe school districts will be able to do that moving forward. So just a moment to explain, the San Diego County Office of Education's Foster Youth Services Coordinating Program is a state-funded and state-mandated program through the Department of Education. Our role is really to convene and assist all of the stakeholders in the lives of students in foster care to be able to work together collaboratively and meet all of their mandates. As such, we pulled together a meeting in August to begin these conversations about how our school districts and child welfare and probation will be complying with the ESSA requirements. We really just wanted to provide a place to get everybody into the same room. So we invited a whole variety of school district personnel. AB 490 school district liaisons are those point people required by our state law that are in each of our school districts who are responsible for ensuring that all students in foster care are, receive their entitlements. We included Title I coordinators, transportation directors, categorical program staff, and folks who oversee student services, pupil services, and special ed. Child welfare was present, as was probation. And truly the goals of that meeting were just to provide a place to start the conversation. We didn't ask anyone to make any decisions, but we shared a lot of the information already shared here this morning, and we actually just scheduled our next meeting for late September, not October, so that we can bring people together to actually start creating viable plans. For many of our school districts, it was the first time that the people from those different areas and departments had talked together about how to do this, even within their own school districts. So I really encourage you looking within your districts for how this is going to happen. I always get this question around, you know, is transportation just a school bus? And the reality is that it really isn't. Most of the time, it's a lot of other ways of getting kids to school. Just very briefly, there are, as you've heard already, a lot of different funding sources that can be used and that often are seen as inadequate or difficult to access. It will be, I think, for many districts the first time that Title I is being utilized for this purpose, so that may feel like a stretch. We have used a combination of the funding from our ACF grant. We've had child welfare local Title I, Title IV dollars, and we've used our own state dollars to jointly fund this transportation over the last several years, and we continue to look at creative ways to combine those funding sources. I do just want to say that we have also done that with no funding. We have had teachers and charter school principals and neighbors and classmates transport children to school of origin because a principal sent out an email or the PTA put out a request or a friend of a friend knew that a child needed to be transported. So please don't think that it always is going to be something very formal. It can also be something rather informal that works and is quite effective. You've heard this a little bit, and I'll just touch on it. We have had instances where kids were piggybacked on existing school bus routes. We've done that both through general education and special education if it is a related service, though I have to say, look carefully at the way IDEA discusses related services and also how that is impacted when it is the placing agency and not the school that moves where the child lives. That offer of FAPE may well change and transportation may no longer be a related service. So that needs to be really thought of carefully. To create a new bus route is exorbitantly expensive for one child. You're talking about a full-time bus driver. That's a lot of funding. So we've had route-to-route handoffs where one bus route meets another bus route, district-to-district boundary handoffs where a bus comes to the district boundary and another picks up. We do have some caregivers being reimbursed through the 4E dollars, though those funds rarely meet the need. That's a difficult funding source, as you've already heard, and in our current group home and foster family agency contract requirements, there are provisions around those entities needing to provide transportation to school of origin, so you may want to look there as well. Our contracted services include taxi companies, as I said, student transport companies. I'm hearing around the state that people are considering Uber, Lyft, or Via services. I think for older kids that actually might be quite viable. There are also shuttle services that take kids to orthodontia appointments or after-school activities. I believe that those may be important resources that should be looked at. We certainly are looking to have our kids bumped into carpools and those types of things whenever that is possible, especially for our high school kids. We've had instances where we were transporting a child who wasn't at her pickup because she was getting a ride home with her friends. Once they start driving, social workers can give permission for that to be okay, and we encourage that. We also have, as I've said, had school and district staff. When I began in this job, that was something that was really seen as a boundary issue and something inappropriate. I've been doing this for 11 years now. It's now really shifted to where that is a way to keep a child connected to school and community, and I just encourage school districts to think about administrative regulations and board policies that will both enable, empower, and protect your staff and your schools when you are considering having school and district staff transport. And then public transportation options, which in some jurisdictions probably are plentiful. The Bay Area out here, or New York City, but clearly in some regions like San Diego, those are less viable. We have kids doing 2-hour commutes one way using public transportation, and obviously that's really only appropriate for our older children. I'm going to now hand it back off to Stevie.
Thank you, Dr. Lustig. We will now hear from Tracy Talbert from DC's Child and Family Services Agency, or CFSA. Tracy has been with CFSA for 16 years. In 2011, she was charged with managing the daily transportation needs of youth in foster care and was subsequently designated the contract administrator. Because DC borders 2 states, Maryland and Virginia, Tracy has the opportunity to work with several LEAs across district, county, and state lines. Although Tracy works for DC's Child Welfare Agency, her duties are similar to the responsibilities of an LEA POC, so her presentation should be informative to both our child welfare and local education agency participants. Thank you, Tracy, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to talk to the group about transportation as it relates to grassroots and direct service. So I am the transportation liaison, so I am the person who facilitates transportation, connecting youth to the service and monitoring the quality of service at CFSA. CFSA, though McKinney-VENTO came out in 2008, really took a deep look at transportation in 2010, and we started looking at the best interests and school stability for our youth because we had so many youth that were changing placements, and with that placement change came school changes. So we would wind up having our kids move to 3 or 4 schools within a school year, and that wasn't really well received by the children, by the families, by the courts. So we had to kind of figure out how we could kind of correct this action and move this train in a different direction. We then at that point decided that we wanted to start supporting transportation services for the youth that were committed to child and family. We wanted to look at school stability. We wanted to look at maintaining those connections that kids have with their teachers, with their friends, and to reduce the trauma for kids. Being placed into foster care is a traumatic experience within itself, but being able to have that connection to the school that you could go back to every day seemed to be beneficial for our kids. So we wanted to look at how we could foster that and support that need for our kids. So at that point, CFSA decided that we were going to solicit for a transportation contract for a provider that was going to support those needs. We found someone that was excellent in what they did, and we awarded a contract, and we started our transportation services to the schools of origin. Once we decided we were going to do transportation, it became a process. How were we going to determine who was going to receive transportation services? So what we did was we looked at children in care. We serviced kids from 0 to 21, 5 being the age that most kids attended school. So at the 5-year point, we said 5 years to 21 would be who we would be supporting. But in order to do that, we had to make sure that we looked at the best interest. So at the time a case comes into Child and Family Services or a child is brought into care, we look at best interest. Is this school placement within the best interest of a child? How are they performing in that school? Are there connections in that school? Are they receiving supportive services in that school? If answers to those questions were yes, we definitely wanted to maintain that school placement. We then spoke with our resource parents or our foster parents to talk to them about what it would look like to travel to and from school with that child. Sometimes it was a doable thing, sometimes it was not. We also looked at family support. So we looked at aunts and uncles and grandmoms who may have lived in that area and how they could play a part in the transportation. For our older kids, DC Public School Systems uses a DC-1 card, which allows free transportation on bus and trains. So we looked at those older youth and being able to put them on Metro. So some of those kids that lived in the Prince George's County area or in the surrounding counties that had never used Metro in the Maryland area, we worked with the social workers to train them, as well as the resource parents. Coming out on a Saturday and kind of walking through what a day would look like with them on the train, timing the trains, timing the buses. We also talked to our resource parents about supporting our kids' needs as far as being able to understand the trauma that they're dealing with. We always wanted to take it back to being trauma-informed and the things and the barriers that they have with being placed in foster care. When we explored child care, we looked at best interest and safety. Is this child able to make a trip on Metro without being lost or confused? Is this school placement safe for them? Is there an issue with their biological family? Are there concerns with mom or dad coming to the school and interrupting the school day? Those are things that we definitely looked at when we looked at safety. The best interest, again, always looking at the youth's best interest. The length of time and the distance of the commute. Is it practical to put a 5-year-old on a transport, and it may take them an hour and a half to get to and from school? They're then required to get to school, perform well, pay attention. There is very little recess, function all day long, then get back on a van and go back home another hour and a half. Is that a viable thing for a small child or a young child? If we could possibly put transportation in place with a resource parent, what would that look like? We also talked about working with our foster parents. Can we talk about adjusting your work schedules? Can we get a little bit of flexibility? Can we find a daycare that's near the school that does a walking before and after care, where they drop the kids in the morning and the daycare provider walks all of the kids to school simultaneously. In the afternoon, she picks them up. That way the kids have an opportunity to burn off some energy. They actually interact with friends. They can start their homework if it's an environment conducive to doing that, but they actually have an opportunity to be just that, a kid. That's something that most kids in care are lacking. If they're eligible for special ed transportation through OSSI and DCPS, working with that office to facilitate that transportation request. Generally, it takes 5 to 10 days for that request to be moved from the existing address to a new placement, but trying to support the family when that happens. So if it's a window of time that we can support them and get the kids to and from school until the special ed transportation kicks in, we do just that. Community resources being other families. So do we have a good friend who also attends that school that maybe the resource parent can drop the child off at that good friend's house and they can go to school together. In the afternoon, they can come back and have some playtime. In doing that, the funny thing is that there's a trade-off because this mom has the kid all week. So that mom may say, hey, on Saturday, can I get a little spare time and you take both kids? If that's something that you can work out, that's beneficial and it allows the kid to be just that, a kid. CFSA provides transportation when all other options have been explored and exhausted. So we've worked with the resource parent and they've tried to take the kids to school and the schedule just isn't working. We've tried to enroll them in the before and after care program, but for some reason they were removed from the before and after care program, be it behavioral, just other concerns. If we are trying to use a family member to support the transport and they've all of a sudden schedules have changed, we then look at using private transportation as a last resort. The social worker completes a referral to us, to my office. We also have a list of questions that we cleanse through to kind of work through what has been done and if best interest, in fact, has been explored for the child. If the transportation request is approved, it normally takes 3 business days for us to put that transport in place. And a lot of people do think that it's just a bus, it's just a referral going over, but it's not. It's about routing a kid. It's about looking at the start time of the school day. It's about looking at what time we're going to put them on the van. We don't have any children on service before 6 a.m. So being able to coordinate and facilitate those times to get them to school at least 15 minutes before the bell rings so that they can go to the restroom, they can catch their breath, they can say hello to your friends. They can have a moment where they can take a deep breath and kind of calm themselves to get ready for that long day that they have. So we do that with the intent of having transportation being time limited. So when we say time limited, we can put transportation in place for 1 day, but it won't exceed 90 days. And within that 90-day window, the expectation is that the family is still working with the social worker and the court and the GAOs and the attorneys involved in the case to create a transportation plan, to find a daycare provider, to be able to support the transportation needs for the students independently at day 91. If for some reason that doesn't happen, we go through a 90-day review period. So we approved you for 90 days. At day 35, we then come back and we say, okay, where are you with this plan? If it's not moving forward, we try to support them with daycare vouchers. We try to give them options. We try to assist them with thinking outside of the box as far as transportation goes. If for some reason at day 90 there's still nothing, we continue to support the child's services. We're not going to not have a kid get to school because we can't come up with a plan that's viable for them. Again, it's about their education and the expectation that we are their parents, so we need to ensure that they get to and from school. Once we've done that, we generally don't transport the entire school year. We've kind of stressed to the family that we need to be constantly moving forward with a plan. It needs to keep going. All of the options need to be explored. If we feel that a youth is on service and for some reason services aren't going well, we have a process. If you have not used transportation, you've missed transportation for whatever reason when the van arrives at your house and you're not ready. If you fail to call and cancel that transportation, you get 3 attempts. If that 3rd attempt happens, we then remove you from services for 5 school days. And that is so, and then the resource parent and the team have to ensure that you are getting to and from school. And that is done because we simply ask that the parents call the transportation company to say there isn't a ride needed today. When that doesn't happen, we actually absorb that cost on CFSA side. So we try to reduce the cost, but we also try to ensure quality service. So in our process of approving transportation, so once we put a child on transportation, there is a quality assurance criteria that happens. So each morning, the transportation company reaches the child's home. The child is then received by the attendant on the bus. Each bus has an attendant and a driver. We don't put more than 5 kids on a transport. That reduces the time that they're on transport, and it reduces the stops that we have to make with each van. The parent then signs the child onto transport. That means that they've acknowledged that the transportation company is there, they've received the child. The attendant then walks the child back to the bus, ensures that they're secure in their seat belts and they're ready to be transported. Once we've picked up every child that's on that route, we then move forward to drop off at school. The attendant gets off the bus with each child, walks them into the office staff signs them into the school, stating that they've received them and the drop-off has happened, the handoff has happened. In the afternoon, it's the exact same process. The students are dismissed, they go to the office, they wait for the attendant to come in, the attendant receives them, they get them from the school signs off that they received them at a particular time, the attendant walks them back to the bus, we make sure everybody's buckled in safe and sound. We do this until we have all the kids on transport, and then we begin to drop off in the afternoon. Once we get the kids to the home, the attendant walks the children to the door, parents receive them, they sign that they've received them, and our day ends. We start our transport at 6 a.m., and all kids must be off transport by 6 p.m. So when we're looking at things that CFSA is working to improve, we're working and we're constantly evolving to be able to support the needs of our family and our children. So in 2017, we want to continue to partner with DCPS and OSSI, dealing with our special ed students, making sure that we can get them to school safely, reducing the time that it takes to approve those kids on transport and route those kids, and making sure that we're working to ensure that we're contacting them when kids are brought into care so that they aren't sending a bus to their school, to the home, and there's no one there to ride that bus. So we partner with them and we connect with them as soon as a kid comes into care. An email is sent over to OSSI to say, this kid is special ed, please discontinue services at this address. So at least we're trying to reduce some of their costs in hopes that they work with us in a partnership to kind of move the process along a little faster to get them on the new address. We're trying to reduce the travel time for our kids. And that means that we're actually looking at placements and concerns with placements and bringing them closer into the District of Columbia. The goal is to have all of our kids in care reside in the District of Columbia. So if we can reduce their travel times by bringing them closer to the home and closer to their school of origin, it would reduce some of the trauma that they're dealing with day in and day out as commuting as adults. The one thing that I'm really passionate about is our youth being able to participate in extracurricular activities. For me, that makes or breaks a high school student, a junior high school student. You're building those team relationships. Right now, our transportation does not support that service because all kids have to be off transportation by 6 p.m. So we're hoping to expand that area of transportation to include after-school activities and games and sporting events so that we're able to give our kids an opportunity to build those relationships within the community and to connect and to bond with the area that they're in. So that concludes my overview of what we do in Child and Family Services Agency. I'm going to hand it back to Steve.
Thank you, Tracy. We'd like to now spend a few minutes responding to some of the questions that we received from our participants. A question that we've received several times on this webinar and others is related to the definition of Title IV-E, and how can you clarify which children are Title IV-E eligible? And I'm going to turn this question over to my colleague at the Children's Bureau, Liz Lovner, who is a Child Welfare Program Specialist and is ACYF's resident expert on Title IV-E.
Hi, everyone. My first caveat for you is that the Child Welfare Agency is going to be looking at IV-E eligibility for every child that's going to be in foster care. They will certainly know who is Title IV-E eligible. They're always looking for that funding to see if those children are eligible. There's a lot of associated eligibility requirements with Title IV-E, the biggest one being an income requirement that is linked back to the home of removal. And that income requirement is pretty low. It is based on the old AFDC program, and so not a lot of kids are going to be eligible just based on that. There are also some other eligibility requirements around how they were removed, around court orders, and also even where they're placed and if their placement meets certain requirements. So bottom line, your Child Welfare Agency will know the answer to that question, and they will know if the IV-E funds are available to that child. I think we also got a question really quick about tribal kids. Kids who, when we say tribal kids, I mean who may be a member of a tribe and may be living on a reservation. They may have come in through the state child welfare agency. They may have come in through the tribal child welfare agency. We just wanted to bring that up today to be clear that those children could equally be eligible for Title IV-E funding through the child welfare agency.
Thank you, Liz. Our next question we have is, do LEAs have to ensure transportation is provided, arranged, and funded for youth who are awaiting foster care placement? And I'll turn this question over to Mary.
Thanks, Stevie. That's a good question, and I know there's a lot of confusion around this. So I urge you to review the guidance. We talk about this in question number 2. So as Stevie mentioned earlier, ESSA amends MCKINNEY-VENTO and removes awaiting foster care placement from the definition of homeless children and youth. And so that means that starting on December 10th, 2016, for the non-covered states, an SEA and LEA must meet the Title I requirements for all children in foster care, including those awaiting foster care placement. And I'm also going to just go over our definition of children in foster care, since we've gotten some questions on that as well. And question number 1 in the guidance defines children in foster care, and this is consistent with fostering connections. So foster care means 24-hour substitute care for children placed away from their parents or guardians, and for whom the Child Welfare Agency has placement and care responsibilities. This includes, but is not limited to, placements in foster family homes, foster homes of relatives, group homes, emergency shelters, residential facilities, child welfare institutions, and pre-adoptive homes. I'm going to pass it back to Stevie. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. This next question is for Dr. Lustig, and I will remind you, Dr. Lustig, to take yourself off of mute when you answer. How frequently does San Diego provide transportation services that do not involve a traditional school bus?
Yes, the majority of well, actually all the transportation services that come through our office here at the County Office of Ed use contracted transportation services. We do have some restrictions, and that's what we're looking at as we're collaborating with our districts more and more and with the county, because we can't transport children who are younger than 10 in those cab services, largely because of safety concerns. These are, not folks, as Tracy described, who are actually supervising children, but these are just cab drivers. But we are using either taxi or shuttle services, van services, those types of things.
Thank you, Michelle. And our last question, we received a lot of questions. Unfortunately, we do not have time to answer all of them. But our last question is for Tracy. Stop. Did the DC Child Welfare System consider utilizing DC public school buses rather than establishing its own transportation system and contracts? If so, why was that option rejected?
We did actually work with DCPS with regards to transportation and buses. Unfortunately, the DC public school system only uses buses for their special education students, and there are not a large volume of buses available. So the buses that they do have, they actually are utilizing for special ed students. And they've actually moved also to using special education vans that they've decorated and painted really nicely. So they don't have the inventory to be able to support the kids that we have in care and the need that we have for transportation in the surrounding counties.
Great, thank you, Tracy. If you have any additional questions for either Michelle or Tracy, I encourage you to reach out to them directly to the email addresses that they've kindly provided on their slides, and those are located on slides 17 and 26. If you have additional questions for either ED or HHS, please contact us via the contact information listed on this slide. If you are an SEA or an LEA, please send your questions to ED's ESSA mailbox. If you are a child welfare agency, please direct your questions to your Center for States Liaison. We also list here 2 websites that you can visit for additional information on ESSA and educational stability more generally. With that, I'd like to thank you and our panelists from DC and San Diego for sharing their experiences and expertise with us today. It was a pleasure to have you both. We hope that everybody has a wonderful afternoon. We apologize for the technical difficulties that we experienced at the start of the webinar, and we hope that does not deter you from tuning in to next week's webinar on collaboration. Thank you so much.